Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Strength and Hormones podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Papanos, and today I'm joined with researcher Dr. Keith Ellis, and we are going to be talking about some of the root causes of long COVID. We're going to be talking about long COVID fatigue, as well as its relation to autoimmunity onset. And I'm just so excited for this conversation because we've explored this topic a little bit on the podcast, but I know that so many people are struggling with this. And maybe you can tell us a little bit, Dr. Ellis, about the relevance of individuals that are struggling with long COVID, and it really just up levels your entire life in terms of how it's affecting individuals' health. And so I think it's such an important conversation to have. So I really appreciate you being here today. And maybe you can just start off by giving us a brief introduction to yourself and some of the research that you're doing.
Sure. Thank you for having me. So to tell you a little bit about me, my background is I'm trained as an organic chemist and what's called a medicinal chemist. Medicinal chemistry is kind of the subset of chemistry that deals with discovering and developing drugs. So I've spent most of my career working in what I think of as kind of early lead discovery for trying to discover pharmaceutical drugs. And it's really interesting work. I like it. I think it's interesting because it works at the interface of small molecule drugs and biological targets, and what I think of it as the pathophysiology or the underlying mechanisms of what causes a disease state, and then how we can develop drugs to actually correct what's going wrong when a disease state occurs, and try to actually help make people feel better. So that's kind of the area I'm interested in and where I work. And I started my career kind of working in the area, also in the area of natural products. So my PhD is actually in organic chemistry. I did natural product total synthesis for my PhD. And when I transitioned into medicinal chemistry, it was using natural products as kind of the starting point to do drug discovery. And that's what I was working on kind of early in my academic career. And like all things in life, and especially in science, they evolve over time. And we don't quite discover drugs the same way as we used to using natural products anymore. But we still use a lot of the same tools and the same approaches. And it was kind of from that background as kind of an academic, a scientist, I'm a professor, that a few years ago I started kind of asking questions and wanted to think about working on long COVID, and that was kind of the starting point for where I went into the scientific literature and found an interesting path of what's going on in long COVID, and thinking about explaining that and trying to help people that are suffering from it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I'm curious as to what your work looked like before COVID was a thing and kind of like why you got into this space. Maybe tell us a little bit
Mhm.
about some of your early days, I suppose, transitioning into
Sure.
exploring long COVID.
So for most of my career, I've really worked more on antibacterial and in the oncology area, doing more drug discovery. And what's always interested me is looking at new what we call mechanisms of action and new molecular targets. So that's why I kind of like that early lead discovery space, is because it's about taking the most current knowledge of what we know about a disease and the new molecular targets that we're finding and validating, and then starting to work on those and finding new mechanisms to come up with drugs to actually help people. And that's just kind of always been the type of problem that has interested me. And then in kind of early 2023, I was kind of at a point where we were wrapping up a couple of projects, and I was going to be looking to do a new project. And I said, uh, kind of looking around at the situation in the world, things were opening back up. The university was open back up, right? We were back in the lab, and I looking around the kind of healthcare landscape and the disease state landscape, I said, well, there's this new thing of long COVID that's kind of starting to be a real problem for people. And it was clear by then that we had a handle on treating acute COVID infections. And between what we learned in 2 years on how to treat acute COVID infections, and um, mutations in the COVID-19 virus that made it a little less virulent or changed the way that it affected people. It was clear that the acute COVID problem we kind of had a handle on it, but this new long COVID phenomenon was starting to be a real problem for people and was really debilitating. And I kind of started asking the same questions that I would normally ask about new projects in oncology, going into the scientific literature to look at long COVID and try to look at underlying mechanisms of what causes long COVID, what molecular targets could be, and then what we could actually do to actually try to help people feel better. And it was an interesting experience of going into the long COVID literature and seeing what was going on that kind of took an unexpected turn for me.
Yeah, I believe it. And I know that that research is still forthcoming, right? And so I'm
Hmm.
sure that there's still a lot of questions to be answered that you are working on
Hmm.
answering. And so I want to just introduce listeners to the term of spike protein. I think some people might be familiar with it, but for those
Hmm.
that aren't, can you talk a little bit about what spike protein is and its
Hmm.
relevance to long COVID symptoms, as well as things like
Hmm.
onset of further disease states like autoimmune diseases and such?
Hmm. So the COVID spike protein is it's a protein on kind of the outer coating of the virus, and it is one of the proteins on the outside of the virus that help it actually infect people and infect cells. Right, so spike protein is known to bind to the ACE2 receptor, which is a receptor that we know is rich in lung tissue. So that's why COVID is considered a respiratory virus, right? Because you inhale viral particles, they get into your lungs, and then that spike protein binds to the ACE2 receptor with a pretty high affinity, and that's one of the mechanisms by which the viral particle is internalized into lung cells in the lung tissue, and that's how an infection starts, right? And once you're infected with the COVID virus, right, it obviously spreads through the body. And the way all viruses work, from COVID to influenza to the common cold, is the virus, it goes through and it uses the machinery in the cell, the biochemical machinery for replication, the ribosome and the other way of making proteins that are all inherent in our own cells. The virus actually hijacks all that machinery and uses human host cell to replicate. And in replicating, it makes all the various proteins that it needs to build more viral particles, right? So a virus will infect a cell, start replicating, makes more daughter viral particles that then get excreted and can go on and cause more viral infection in the body, and then you can pass it to other people, right? So the spike protein is replicated during viral replication, and then when viral particles are assembled, it of course gets built back into that outside surface of the virus and then distributed in the body. So that's what we think of as normal viral life cycle in a viral infection that we would think of and call an acute infection for the COVID virus. Then when it comes to then longer term effects and long COVID, so the COVID spike protein, now there's pretty good data in the literature that the spike protein can do all kinds of kind of bad things in the body on its own, either while attached to the viral particle, or you can get shedding of that protein and it kind of breaks off from the main viral particle and you've got spike protein floating around by itself, right? And it's known in the literature that spike protein itself has cardiotoxicity, right? It actually is kind of toxic to heart muscle tissue. Um, the spike protein has been shown, there's pretty good evidence and data that it causes microclots in long COVID, where the spike protein binds to a clotting protein in the blood called fibrinogen and causes fibrinogen to change conformation. And that's actually the initiation event for microclot formation, which is one of the proposed like causative mechanisms, driving mechanisms behind long COVID. So that's another kind of bad actor effect that spike protein can have. It can go on, and it obviously when it's floating around in circulation, the body can raise antibodies against it, right? That's to help fight off the infection. But you can also get other effects like autoantibody formation and things against some of these unnatural complexes that are generated. That spike protein catalyzes an unnatural complex like a microclot, and you get autoantibody formation against the microclot that can lead to some of the autoimmune type issues people have. There's data in the literature that's thought that the spike protein can interact in various ways with various types of immune cells and cause some of the immune system dysfunction. And really, it's a bad actor that can go into various places in the body and cause a lot of dysfunction.
Got it. Okay. And so, how often would you say that we're seeing, and maybe you can provide us a statistic if you have one, that we're
Mhm.
seeing that individuals that have long COVID are experiencing autoimmune onset?
Ooh, that's a statistic I haven't seen before, specifically for the autoimmune subpopulation
Okay.
in long COVID, mainly because that takes a lot of different forms, right? So, um, a lot of times people with long COVID will end up with mast cell activation as kind of that autoimmune. But then there's other people where it's unclear whether it's like long COVID that's causing the autoimmune effects, or if it's some kind of co-indication, like they look like they have lupus or another autoimmune disease that's occurring with the long COVID. And it's very difficult sometimes to tease out causation versus correlation, right? They're occurring together, but it's unknown whether one's related to each other. So I think it's hard to nail down the statistics, and I haven't seen exact statistics on that before.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, and that makes sense. And I know, one of the places that you've done quite a bit of research and talk about is fatigue and that being a
Mhm.
symptom of long COVID. And I would say most individuals that experience long COVID, that is a symptom, not with
Mhm.
everyone, right? And I'd love to talk
Yeah.
a little bit about why, maybe you could talk about like the correlation with mitochondrial dysfunction and why
Mhm.
fatigue is a common symptom and some of the natural compounds that you've been exploring that can be a
Mhm.
solution for just that pure symptom of fatigue.
Sure, sure. So fatigue, when I think of the symptoms for long COVID, I kind of divide them into what I think of as the core symptoms that the majority of people really seem to have. And then there's this broader constellation of symptoms where some people get them, some people don't. And it's where you see this almost heterogeneity in long COVID, where every patient's case is just a little bit different. But fatigue seems to be one of those unifying symptoms that most people have. And it does tie into the mitochondrial dysfunction. One of the thoughts behind, from a mechanistic point of view, because my big thing is I really like to understand things at a mechanistic level. I try to always think even of biological mechanisms in almost chemical terms, right? Because that's the best way we can understand them to actually then go on and develop drugs and actually help people. So when I think in mechanistic terms about long COVID and the origins of fatigue as a symptom, one of the kind of hypotheses behind how that's occurring is when spike protein drives formation of microclots, right? These microclots form, they get sticky, they're unnatural clots that are kind of amorphous, right? They're not the normal ordered clots we have to stop bleeding. They're these amorphous masses that are actually a lot of times termed, the technically correct scientific term is amyloids of fibrinogen. They're sticky. They actually stick to platelets, cause platelet hyperactivation. They also stick to red blood cells. And one of the things that's happened, and there's actually really nice data in literature, there's like electron micrographs showing microclots formed and isolated under a microscope where red blood cells are actually bound to the microclot, and you get this tying up, or this aggregation of red blood cells with the microclots. What's thought is that part of the effect that happens is, what's the job of red blood cells? Well, it's to deliver oxygen into your tissues, right? So if you're tying up red blood cells, the red blood cells are still oxygenated. They're still carrying oxygen themselves, but they're not able to diffuse into tissues like muscle and other tissues in the body to actually deliver oxygen to the site of action in the cells of where it's needed. So it's not that um, this amalgamation of and this binding of red blood cells to microclots is what is kind of lowering oxygen delivery to the tissues, and that the lowering of oxygen delivery to the tissues is actually part of what's driving the fatigue and the mitochondrial dysfunction, right? Where if you've got impaired oxygen delivery to the cells, then you've got impaired oxygen delivery to the mitochondria. The mitochondria start the mitochondria stop functioning correctly. They're functioning more in a hypoxic environment. So that causes that mitochondrial dysregulation. And one of the side effects of that ends up being fatigue.
Got it. Okay, that's super helpful to understand with the microclots. It's definitely like a newer term to me, so I appreciate you sharing
Mhm.
more about its relevance. And you've explored some possible natural remedies
Mhm.
for the fatigue aspect of things. And is
Mhm.
it because these are working on like dissolving the microclots? Is there some type of mechanism of how they're working on the
Mhm.
microclots? Or explain to us a little bit more about how these natural solutions might work and what a couple of those might be.
Sure, sure. So there's kind of two natural solutions that I have been working on to really to help people with long COVID. One is kind of something that is new, custom formulated that I kind of designed using the research literature, and then one is an application of something that's kind of been out there and people know about. So if you look at the microclots hypothesis and look at it as from a mechanistic point of view, and really are looking at the pathophysiology of long COVID, what's the mechanism of how spike protein and long COVID are actually causing all of these malfunctions in mechanisms in the body, which lead to the symptoms. One of the things that is clear is the microclots really are what's driving a lot of this. So when I started working on this, I found a really nice study in the literature that was done by some of the microclot scientists, where they used a experimental pharmaceutical cocktail to try to treat people with long COVID, and it was a small study. It was about 90 patients. Um, and it used this again experimental cocktail. It's called triple anticoagulant therapy. It's actually a cocktail of three anticoagulants that you take at the same time. So it's kind of a powerful and pharmaceutical cocktail. But they had really good results with it. Again, small study, 90 patients, but there was about an 80% recovery rate from long COVID. And the reason the study really interested me was they actually did the parallel work with the clinical study to examine the microclots in these patients. So all the patients in the study had long COVID. They did an assay for microclotting. That's a research laboratory assay, and showed they all had microclots before they started the trial. And then afterwards, the patients that recovered, in all of them, their microclots were gone, and the patients that didn't recover still had their microclots. So that was actually a really informative and really, I thought, well done study, and it was had a really sound mechanistic rationale. They used these three pretty powerful anticoagulants to help break up the microclots, and if you could do that, people recovered from long COVID. And the issue, so when I found this, I went and started talking to the people with long COVID that I had gotten to know. And I was like, guys, this problem's solved. Why aren't you all on triple anticoagulant therapy? Like, why isn't everybody just taking this and everybody can recover? And what I very quickly learned from the long COVID patients is they had trouble getting their hands on triple anticoagulant therapy, because there's really three issues with triple anticoagulant therapy, using it, especially for long COVID. So number one is you're taking three anticoagulants together. They're powerful drugs. It's nothing to fool around with. There is a significant side effect risk of bleeding when you're taking three anticoagulants together. So it's in and of itself, there is a safety issue with trying to take those three drugs together. Secondly, the physicians were reluctant to prescribe it to a certain extent, understandably, right? You don't want to just hand a patient kind of powerful anticoagulants to take together, I think a lot of physicians that would give them pause to want to do that. And there's always the in the day and age we live in, especially post COVID, physicians want more and more evidence based data before they're willing to do a lot of things. They want some kind of large randomized clinical trial to show that it really works. So there's a safety issue. Doctors wouldn't prescribe it, and then if people could get it, one of the drugs is really expensive, and insurance wouldn't necessarily cover it for long COVID. So there's an affordability issue. So I kind of looked at all that information and said, well, what we really need is a safer and accessible with an affordable version of triple anticoagulant therapy. So safer meaning less powerful, less potent, something that doesn't have as high a risk of bleeding as a side effect. So a safer version, an accessible version, preferably over the counter where you didn't need a prescription, and then something that was affordable. And I kind of mentioned when I was introducing myself that early in my career I had used natural products as the starting point for developing new drugs, and that was kind of a standard thing we used to do. And in seeing the situation with triple anticoagulant therapy, the thought I had was, well, what if I reverse the normal process we use with natural products? What if I flip the script and start with the pharmaceutical drugs that are too powerful, and actually reverse engineer that cocktail into a natural formula that had the same mechanisms of action, would do the same thing in the body, where the components were from natural sources, were safer because they're a little less potent, and if they're coming from natural sources, I'd be able to formulate an over-the-counter product that people could use. So I went ahead and did that kind of research work to design that formula and produce that. And the end result was a custom formulated product to help people recover from long COVID microclots that I call CircuGuard. And so the important part of that formula is taking these three components together that have these three specific mechanisms of action that are the same as triple anticoagulant therapy. And I designed it and made it, and people started taking it, and it helped people to start recover from long COVID. And I did one extra thing when I was putting the formula together, knowing fatigue is one of the primary issues of people with long COVID. I started thinking about what can I put in that formula to help people specifically with the fatigue that they're experiencing. And since there's indications that the fatigue is coming from an oxygen delivery issue to the tissues, I went ahead and put what people from the sports and the workout arena know as something to boost oxygen delivery to the tissues. I put in beetroot extract in the formula, and the nitrous oxide in the beetroot extract actually helps improve oxygen delivery to the tissues, and that helps with the fatigue as well. So that's also a second thing that people can take kind of on their own just to help with the fatigue, is beetroot extract. And then I added that into my custom formula with these other ingredients to help with the microclots.
Got it. Wonderful. That's really awesome that you have that as an option and that it's helping people. And yeah, I mean, I've loved and used beetroot juice for so many years.
Mm-hmm.
Just, I mean, initially in the sports setting, using it with
Yeah.
athletic performance to be able to help with blood flow and oxygenation of muscles. But I mean, it can even be a great option for like hypertension and high blood pressure,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's so many uses of it. And I'm curious with your product because I do know that with
Mm-hmm.
like traditional beetroot supplementation that it's activated through saliva, and so it's really
Mm-hmm.
important that people aren't utilizing like antibacterial mouthwashes and things because
Mm-hmm.
then that could kill the salivary enzymes that are helping to convert those nitrates over. Is it something kind of similar, or is it different because this is in like a capsule type form?
It's different because it's in a capsule. So you get
Got it. Okay.
activation once you get opening of the capsules in the GI tract and absorption across the line into the GI tract.
Got it. Okay. Okay. And outside of helping with the fatigue and then helping with
Mm-hmm.
these microclots, is there any other symptoms that that you're kind of exploring that are,
Mhm.
that either this formulation is really helping with,
Mhm.
or that you have seen other types of strategies help individuals?
So the interesting thing with and why I kind of ended up really focusing in on the microclots is if you can deal with the microclots, you actually help kind of all of the symptoms. And in the study that they did with the pharmaceutical triple anticoagulant therapy, the 80% recovery was kind of the overall recovery from long COVID, but they actually benchmarked a whole list of 10 or 15 symptoms and how well people recovered from the individual symptoms. And the pharmaceutical version helped with recovery from all the symptoms, everything from the fatigue and the brain fog through the cardiac symptoms, like the shortness of breath and the tachycardia, and even into some of the more severe ones like the POTS, as well as some of the neurological symptoms like the headaches and the depression and anxiety. So that's a really important aspect of thinking about microclots and trying to target those. And that specific mechanism is because it seems to be a central driving kind of causative mechanism behind multiple symptoms. When you can resolve the microclots, you're actually resolving multiple symptoms. And people have been seeing that with my natural CircuitGuard formula as well, where it not only helps with the fatigue, but it does help with the brain fog. It helps with the cardiac symptoms, the shortness of breath. All of a sudden, people can get out of bed and function again, right? Because the bad thing about long COVID is it is so debilitating for so many people. It really turns them from being a functional person with a good life into someone that is, if not bedridden, then certainly couch bound, not active much of the day, right? A lot of people with long COVID suffer from post exertional malaise, where if they do too much, then they have these hard crashes that can take hours, days, sometimes weeks to recover from a day of activity. And what people that are telling me that have tried my formula are saying is that it helps them kind of get back to being able to function in their daily life. They don't need to nap as much or at all. They can actually be a functional parent to help take care of their kids or to go to work. And that it helps with the brain fog and even some of the depression and anxiety, as well as the more severe cardiac type symptoms like the dysautonomia.
Got it. Okay. So it sounds like the microclots then is kind of your hypothesis is like the root cause of these long COVID
Yeah.
type symptoms. So, okay, I'm
Mm-hmm.
understanding that. So tell us a little bit more about, I know we talked a little bit about the microclots at the beginning, but
Mm-hmm.
now I have even more questions because of,
Sure.
what you explained with the mechanism of how it works,
Mm-hmm.
with how your formula works on the microclots. So what are we seeing with long COVID and what it's doing to the vascular system as a whole? Are we just seeing
Okay.
that it's causing these like blood clots? Is that kind of like what the microclot is functioning as? Or are we seeing like endothelial dysfunction and other types of issues that are at play?
You're seeing really everything. So it kind of starts with the microclot, and again, the issue with the microclot is it's not just a clot; it's this disordered protein formation that is in effect a clot, right? So because again, this is spike protein, it binds to fibrinogen, causes conformational changes into unnatural conformations. That's like this root problem, because then you get growth into this microclot that's this amorphous mass. It sticks to things that it shouldn't, right? It sticks to platelets, hyperactivates them, results in serotonin dumping from platelets, all kinds of the platelet activation cascade that's involved with coagulation, sticks to red blood cells, sticks to other proteins and cytokines and other small molecules in the normal circulatory system, and then things kind of snowball from there. Right. So what they're seeing with microclots is there is a lot of endothelial dysfunction. There is especially inflammation of the endothelium. So the lining of the blood vessels in the body ends up being inflamed. And when that happens, signaling molecules get released, right? Inflammation is not just a localized event, right? It actually releases other signaling molecules. And it snowballs with these downstream effects. So you get microclots. The microclots cause the endothelial inflammation. That inflammation triggers not only inflammation response kind of globally in the body, but it also triggers immune response. It triggers a lot of these other effects that you see. So and that's why one of the really difficult things with long COVID is it's a multi-system disease, right? In kind of modern medicine, we have siloed the various systems of the body into specialties, right? So you've got your cardiac specialist, you've got your neurology specialist, you've got your endocrine specialist, you've got your rheumatologist that's dealing in immune response. And long COVID is really bad because it crosses all of these specialties, and it makes it more difficult to understand. It makes it very difficult sometimes for people to get good diagnoses, and it's making it more difficult in general for science and for medicine to really figure out how to treat and deal with it, because you have to treat it as a one central disease that has all these downstream effects that are affecting all these different systems, as opposed to a disease of origin in a specific system in the body, which is the way most diseases work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why people, specialists get so confused because you go to the neurologist for specific symptoms and then they send you over to the endocrinologist and then you're just playing ping pong between people that don't know how
Yeah.
to help you with the symptoms that are all interconnected. So
Yeah.
really it's like we need to get to the source of, okay, what's starting all of this to begin. And so I'm curious as to why does COVID in
Mhm.
itself attack the vascular system?
Um, so I guess why is a little more difficult question. How is an easier question, right? We know that the spike protein in and of itself binds to a lot of things that cause inflammation in the body. So how and why COVID itself kind of evolved to have all these inflammatory and other type effects in the body. I'm not a specialist in viral evolution and kind of the why, but what is interesting about COVID is it does seem to be in its own way unique versus other viruses we're used to dealing with medically, right? If we think about flu, okay, you're used to some inflammation with the flu, it makes you sick, but it flu and even things like HIV don't really cause this type of like global endothelial inflammation that we see with COVID. It really is kind of very specific to the spike protein, and the other proteins that are a part of that viral genome are what really cause the kind of more systemic effects that we see, that are kind of well beyond what we're used to seeing with other viruses.
Got it. That makes sense. It's unique than how it functions. I see.
Mhm.
So with the microclots, what is the timeline we're looking at in terms of like the evolution of them from, maybe like when someone gets the viral infection and then
Mhm.
when these microclots develop? And then what does the timeline look like typically once someone might start on this anticoagulant, like
Mhm.
natural approach that you're talking about,
Sure.
in terms of seeing the microclots resolve?
Mhm. So yeah, I have not seen any good data yet exactly nailing down the time frame for microclot formation and kind of that transition from recovering post acute COVID infection to really crossing over into that area of having long COVID, right? Because really, long COVID, we consider your 3 to 6 months past acute COVID infection. You still have some of those symptoms from the acute COVID infection, and really you start developing some new additional symptoms when you cross over into that long COVID. I have not seen any definitive studies yet that kind of timelines microclot formation through that. Although that's actually a really good idea for a good study to do from time points. It's probably because it's hard to predict which people are going to get long COVID, and you'd have to have the blood samples from before they got long COVID. But as far as I know in the literature, every patient that's been really tested for that has long COVID that's really been tested for microclots, the majority of people really do have them. And again, it's not an easy test. It's not a test that is clinically available. You can't go to your primary care doctor and say, "Hey, can you run a microclot test for me?" It's not that kind of test, right? It's actually still very much a research lab test. I know they're working on commercializing technology to make it more available. But it is basically by the time that you're in that 3 to 6 month window where you're developing long COVID, the microclots have developed and are present. And the thinking is that the spike protein is still circulating around mainly from viral reservoirs in the body. And that's kind of the driving, what I've heard called pathobiology of long COVID, is there is a viral reservoir someplace in the body. There's a lot of debate about where that is. Some people say the CNS in the brain is one of the primary places for viral reservoirs. A lot of people will say the GI tract, and that the virus persists in the GI tract and affects the gut microbiome, and that's it. Ends up what allows the virus to stick around long enough and to have this persistence that you end up developing microclots and developing long COVID. And then once you're in that long COVID stage and you're really sick, in terms of starting to take something for microclots, with the pharmaceutical version of triple anticoagulant therapy that they did that study on, they stratified the patients into two populations. It was kind of mild long COVID and then severe long COVID. And the patients that were in the mild long COVID group, they had on pharmaceutical triple anticoagulant for therapy for 2 to 4 months. And then the ones that were in the severe group, they had on triple anticoagulant therapy for 4 to 6 months. And then that's when they saw that people would either recover or not. So with my natural formula, I've pretty much been telling people plan on taking it for 3 to 6 months, right? Because the natural compounds, and again, when I designed it, I did a kind of a 1-to-1 replacement. So drug A has this mechanism of action, and I found a natural ingredient with the same mechanism of action. And the important part is taking the three compounds together that all have the combination of mechanisms of action is what deals with the microclot. So I tell people, be prepared to take it for 3 to 6 months, because what both the pharmaceutical and the natural version of triple anticoagulant therapy are really doing is they are slowing down formation of additional microclotting. And it is slowing down microclot formation to give the body time to naturally clear the microclots that are persisting in the bloodstream. Because the other interesting and really kind of almost insidious thing about microclots is our natural processes for breaking down clots don't work very well on these microclots because they are in these unnatural conformations. We don't have proteins that are readily available to come in, enzymes to actually come in and break down these clots. So one of the reasons they stick around longer is because they're unnatural. So the triple anticoagulant therapy, whether it's the pharmaceutical or the natural version, basically slows down the formation of microclots and gives the body more time to be an ability to clear the existing microclots. And eventually over time, you clear all the microclots and then you can stop taking it once the microclots have cleared.
I see. Wow, really incredible that that there's this option for individuals, and like I said, it's so fascinating to learn about these microclots. I'm curious a little bit about, you mentioned there's not really an accessible lab measure for
Mm-hmm.
microclots, but I assume, and I've seen through patients, what long COVID shows up as, within other laboratory measures that are accessible,
Mm-hmm.
things like C-reactive protein and,
Yeah.
even some of these like vascular type markers as well. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious, like, are there any favorite blood tests that you maybe have that someone can get to be able to assess
Mm-hmm.
that they're improving, that their body is essentially functioning more optimally
Mm-hmm.
once they no longer are dealing with these microclots?
So I'm not a clinician.
Yeah.
So I don't. I try to be a little careful, and right? The ones that you name, like C-reactive protein. What when we look at that clinically, what are we really looking at? We're looking at inflammation, right? So we can use the existing clinical testing. It tells us about what symptoms are happening. It tells us it gives us the underlying mechanism for kind of these downstream effects that are happening in long COVID, whether it's inflammation or some kind of immune activation, because there's all kinds of blood tests and blood panels you can do for immune response, right? Those are all giving you a piece of the picture. And I think the really difficult thing with long COVID, and why I do not envy the clinicians. And I try to be nice to them, even though I'm hard on them sometimes, because people aren't getting as much help as they really need. I don't envy the physicians, because I think they can look at a lot of data and not necessarily see the same thing or a similar pattern for people with long COVID, because it is this heterogeneous disease that seems to present differently in different people. And that's just because the clinical laboratory testing that we can do kind of mimics and helps inform us with data about the various systems in the body that are kind of in the silos they're in. So you're looking at silo by silo data, which tends to be more downstream, and it's just harder to run these types of experiments and get data on these more upstream effects, because there's just no clinical testing for them.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I've seen that clinically as well, that, some individuals, I mean, both symptoms too, right? Some people, it's like fatigue
Yeah.
is our worst symptom of long COVID. Other people, it's brain fog or it's recurrent blood
Yep.
clots, right? And then others, they've got really high C-reactive protein. And then other people, their C-reactive protein looks pretty good, So it really
Yeah.
does present differently for everyone. So I think you're right in that it has to be this individualized picture of what we're looking at here. And, I was talking to you offline before we started about how like your
Mhm.
Substack has so much great information on there. And I'm just curious as to,
Mhm.
outside of your formulation that you have, what are some
Mhm.
areas that you are currently exploring that
Mhm.
you think are valuable for the listeners to know about, that you are talking about,
Mhm.
on your Substack, or that you're currently researching?
Yeah, so one of the things I'm trying to look at is this viral reservoirs question, because you can work on the microclots, you can treat the microclots, and you can resolve those. But if there's still viral reservoirs present, you're just going to keep forming more microclots. So that's one thing I'm looking at. Particularly, I've been looking at the GI tract as a potential source of a viral reservoir, and what we can do to actually help with that. Again, more from this kind of natural and and more available way, not necessarily with pharmaceuticals. Because when I started this, right, I was like, okay, I want to work on long COVID. I develop, I do kind of early stage drug discovery. And one of the reasons I wanted to get started on long COVID is it takes 10 to 15 years to actually discover and develop a pharmaceutical drug, from just starting through a doctor being able to write a script for it. It's a long process. So when I originally started on long COVID, I wanted to get that process started, because the sooner it gets started, the sooner you're into that 10 to 15-year clock. And what became really apparent for me in the literature was we're still building the foundational science that you need to even start discovery and development of real pharmaceutical drugs for long COVID. And that kind of got to me, because it's, well, what are people supposed to do in the meantime while they're waiting around for drugs? So I've been now trying to focus more on kind of the natural remedies approach. What can we do with the information we know about long COVID, and with the tools we have in hand that are natural and that can be used in over the counter products that can actually help people, like in 2025, like this year, and not wait till 2040, right, to actually have a therapeutic drug come out. So I'm trying to work on that for kind of the viral reservoir in the GI tract. It is one of the things that I'm really focusing on, and then also trying to look at A lot of people are taking a lot of different products for spike protein degradation and trying to put some thought into are we really doing that in the optimal way, or are there some changes in approaches or other things we can be using to help also with clearing spike protein in the body.
Fascinating. I can't wait to see where your work continues to develop. Could you provide us with any kind of sneak peeks into what you're thinking from like a GI perspective
Mm-hmm.
of where things are originating within that area?
So I think the key to the GI tract, and this is like universally, this isn't just long COVID. Like I think for 5+ years now, maybe closer to 10, the key to the GI tract seems to be the microbiome, right? And how the both the identity and the balance of the microbiome in the GI tract seems to really affect a lot of different disease states. And that's kind of something I'm keen in on. Some of the questions I'm trying to ask and get answers to is kind of how is long COVID affecting the gut microbiome? What are the shifts that are occurring, and in which of the bacteria in the microbiome? Right? What's missing? What's there in overabundance that shouldn't be? Those types of questions, and then figuring out what can be done to try to rebalance that gut microbiome to see if that can actually help correct and potentially eliminate any kind of viral reservoir in the GI tract.
Fascinating. Always comes back to the microbiome, at least
Yeah.
nowadays, now that we know of it, right?
Right, exactly, and it's important in so many different things. And one example of this is there's some great data out showing that that there's impaired serotonin levels and impaired serotonin transport in people with long COVID, and that actually that issue is not in the brain. That issue is partly in the platelets, because platelets are the biggest store of serotonin in the body. When you get microclot formation, it activates the platelets and they dump all their serotonin, and that actually is what leads to lower levels of serotonin in long COVID. But serotonin originates from the gut microbiome in the GI tract, right? So a lot of these things are very much tied to the gut microbiome, which is why I'm kind of taking a look at that.
So interesting. I alluded a little bit to your Substack and how there's tons of
Mm-hmm.
information there. We talked a little about your formulation. Tell us a little bit
Mm-hmm.
more about where people can learn more about your work
Sure.
and anything else that maybe you have outside of the formulation and your Substack.
Mm-hmm. So if people go to keithcellisphd.com, that's kind of the central hub. Everything's there. There's a link to the Substack and all the research. And when I first started doing this, I decided that I really wanted to publish all the research I was doing and figuring things out where people could get it and it was accessible and they'd be able to read it and judge it for themselves, which is why I decided to put it on Substack. So if you go to keithcellisphd.com, there's a link to the Substack. There's a link to go buy the product, CircuGuard. There is a link to all my social media. I've made a lot of videos of the content on the Substack that are on TikTok and YouTube. They can join the Facebook group or join the email list to keep up to date on what's coming next. And that's kind of the central hub is the keithcellisphd.com. And if they want a quick and easy way to go try the formulation, they can go to circuguard.com. That's the real easy ordering page. And there is a button on there that will take you to the full product page that gives you all the detailed science behind each of the ingredients and how it was chosen, and the scientific literature references behind the mechanisms of all the natural ingredients.
Wonderful. And we'll include that in the show notes below. Thank you so much, Dr. Ellis, not just for your time, but also for the work you're doing. And again, I'm really excited to continue to follow it, and I hope our listeners will as well.
Great. Thank you very much.